Good afternoon to you once again. Let's continue to bring you more reaction to the passing of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. We're joined now by former Minister Trevor Manuel, senior member of the ANC as well. Mr. Manuel, it's wonderful to talk to you on a day like today as we reflect on the passing of the Arch, a tectonic shift in the history of our country. How do you feel this afternoon?
Thank you very much, Michelle, and good afternoon to all your viewers. The first thing I'd like to do is to extend to Mama Leah, the family, and especially the Anglican Church, my sincerest condolences. It's very important to remember that the Arch was a creature of the Church. He had spent all of his adult life in the priesthood, and it was his home. There wasn't a political home. It was a church home, and as Bishop Mpumulwana said on an earlier occasion, he wasn't a politician, he was a struggler for justice. And it's quite important to understand that context of the Arch. And of course, the last while had seen his physical decline. The last moment that he was out, we were privileged to be at the service to honor him on his 90th birthday. Just over 2 months ago, but he's been in very serious decline, and you know, as with other issues, I'm told that the Archbishop had no fear of death. A number of years ago, he started preparing for this day, so there's sadness, but there's no shock in his passing. It's because of the way in which he interacted with life and society. You know, I first met him in 1984 when I was a stand-in at the UDF offices, which was accommodated in the offices of the SACC in Khotso House in Johannesburg, that building that was blown up by the apartheid regime. And the Archbishop knew that by taking us in there was always going to be a risk, because the regime didn't want the UDF to flourish, but he was quite prepared that people needed a voice. And he did this at a time when he himself hadn't aligned to the UDF. He wasn't the patron of the UDF at the start. But he knew that this movement needed a home, and so he acted. But there were rules, and amongst the rules were that he wanted to know who the individuals were who were working in the building. He wanted to meet them. And very importantly, they were required to join devotions every morning. Those were the rules of the SACC. Those were the rules of Archbishop Tutu. Those were the rules that he lived by. And he brought people closer to him because of the clarity of the way in which he acted. And so throughout a number of years, a number of engagements, you know, in 1988, we launched the Defiance campaign. And one of the big topics, by then it was already the Archbishop of Cape Town, one of the big issues was taking on apartheid beaches. And the beach at the Strand was cordoned off with barbed wire by the SADF, and it was Archbishop Tutu that led people onto that beach, and then joined others at Melkbos Strand to do exactly the same. And he said very clearly, all God's beaches for all God's people. And he was resolute in that. The following year was again detained. And it was Archbishop Tutu that took the cudgels to the office of P.W. Botha, who was the President of the Republic, to demand the release of detainees, especially those who'd been repeatedly detained. And I was one of the individuals to benefit from his very direct interaction. I think that we had a very soft spot for each other. I knew that he liked the name Trevor. His eldest son is named Trevor. And of course, Trevor Huddleston was a link point in the name as well. And so he always had a very soft spot for me, I thought. Not an opportunity to exploit it, but our engagement was always, the lines were clear. He was a person of the cloth. He was a man of the church. He would lead us in struggle, but he was not a political animal. In fact, when the ANC was unbanned in 1990, much to our disappointment, he ordered that priests of the Anglican Church not join political parties, because they needed to be reconcilers in communities. He didn't stand back in terms of his views. He was always able to really talk to power, to talk sense to power, and to hold out a number of issues in the same way. The 11th of February 1990 was difficult because the release of Nelson Mandela was very sudden, sprung on us a previous day, and we didn't actually know where to accommodate him. And when Madiba and Mamwini were at the City Hall in Cape Town, we then raised the issue with the Arch, and he said no. Tata, he said to Madiba, you must come and stay in Bishop's Court this evening. And so through his actions, he was able to bring the church down from a very high and lofty position. He wasn't your grace as the Archbishop, he was just the Arch. And everybody related to him. And in the same way, he took the church onto the streets when protest was necessary. He made sure that we all understood that the Archbishop and the church was of us. It wasn't a body from England imposing its will on us. It was of us. And I think that made a very strong difference to the church, to Christianity, and it was non-denominational in its content and substance. And I think it's all of those things we draw together. And we cannot ever, for a moment, forget his leadership of the TRC and his ability to bring out the pain from people. And so that quote that you read just before the news, Michelle, is fundamentally important, because we must never forget that Tutu lived by the diktat of love. He loved, and it was his interpretation of the word. And I think throughout history we know that the most successful transformers of societies led with love, not with hatred. And it's that we must understand, and that we must try and emulate.
I feel like, there's so much from what you've said now. I feel like just in the reflections of the Arch, he wasn't beholden. As you say, he wasn't a political animal, actually. He wasn't beholden to any political party. We know he was a massive thorn in the side of the National Party, as he then became in the side of the ANC as well. In fact, actively praying, he said, for the downfall of the ANC.
He said that it left him no choice, and I think that is the strength of his position. His position was that of a religious leader and of a leader of society, rather than, as you say, Michelle, a political leader who was beholden, and therefore he could speak truth to power. And he could do so fearlessly. And, I think that I said earlier that he wasn't part of the UDF, and he wasn't the patron of the UDF in the beginning. But as repression was entrenched in society, he felt the need for alignment and leadership. And so you may even recall that when Zinzi Mandela addressed the crowd at Jabulani Amphitheatre, it was an event to celebrate the Nobel Prize that Archbishop Tutu had been awarded. And it was in that celebration when she told the story of her father refusing to bow down to P.W. Botha's offer of a condition of freedom. All of these things came together because they weren't compartmentalized into church and state. There was a flow through. What was most important were the values and the commitment to the transformation of society. That statement that he made when asked about what apartheid did was, "It made me feel like I wasn't a child of God," is profoundly important in the way in which he saw life, saw responsibility, and saw people. It was the essence of his humanity that allowed him to reach out to people wherever they are, regardless of background, and wrap his arms around them in a distinct kind of way.
You talked, Mr. Manuel, about your interactions and your very long personal and political history for yourself as a member of the UDF in the 80s during your detention. But in the later years, there was that exchange that you had with the Arch. I believe it was at a ceremony to honor the late Kader Asmal, where he said to you, "You don't belong in this government." Can you tell us about that day?
Yeah, that was towards the end. It was as you said, Michelle, ahead of the appointment of or the appointment of Jacob Zuma as President of the Republic, Tutu said that we're going to have problems, and he foretold those problems, and was at a ceremony to plant the ashes of and planted 3-4 Kader Asmal at Kirstenbosch, when the Archbishop said to me, and you know, he had a kind of a way of speaking to me, Lighty J, in that sort of Tsotsi Tao, and then he said to me, "But I don't belong in the government with those people. I'm not of them." You know, it was at one level deeply hurtful, but at another level compelled me to sit up and take note of what was going on all around me. I left of my own volition later, but it was in fact the bluntness of the message of the Arch to me, and it wasn't a voice that was casting me aside. It was telling me that I belonged on the side of the good. It was that kind of message, but bluntly put.
You know, when I introduced our interview with you this afternoon, Mr. Manuel, I talked about this being, his passing being a tectonic shift in the history of our country. In a way, you know, you talked about the Arch not being afraid of death, and so many people that we've spoken to this morning on the channel have talked about the joy that no doubt, in fact, Justice Albie Sachs was talking to one of my colleagues a little earlier, and he said, you know, he envisages the Arch going to the gates of heaven, being embraced by his maker. That's what he thinks of as he thinks of the passing of the Arch, with a glint in his eye. But that tectonic shift that I'm talking about, you know, us being a country of the likes of Nelson Mandela, Amakhatrada, Andrew Mlangeni, Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. That is who we were. Is this now our history? What is our future in terms of leadership?
Look, it's very important that we not talk about those values and those individuals in our past only. It's very necessary to recreate some stuff, and the stuff that we need to recreate and emphasize are actually the values of our Constitution. See, the Constitution commits South Africa to be a non-racial and non-sexist country. But it also asks us to recall the injustices of the past and then act in a particular way. And the ways in which we must act include a commitment to raise the living standards of all citizens and to free the potential of each person. It talks about equality before the law. It deals with all of those issues in the preamble, founding provisions, and the Bill of Rights. And that, as President Ramaphosa said just last week, that Constitution is actually the birth certificate of this nation. It's complex because we speak 11 languages, but it's the birth certificate. It's what ought to hold us together. And so these values that the Archbishop lived by and espoused, and all of those other names that you mentioned are included, are entrenched in our Constitution. The difficulty, Michelle, is that we are letting it go. We aren't placing emphasis on those kinds of values and ensuring that successive generations will know this is who we are, this is where we come from, and this is what we must strive for, and that we should not rest until the words of the Constitution, We have raised the living standards of all South Africans, and that's a continuous action. And that's what we ought to hold ourselves to account to. I mean, I think that there's too much that's gone astray. Too much focus on the self, too much focus on wealth accumulation by any means necessary, and too little emphasis on the values that ought to hold us together as a nation, a shining light, a beacon to the rest of the world, where the judgment of us as a people is by the extent of our caring for one another, for our environment, and for our continent.
Trevor Manuel, let me thank you for your time this afternoon here on Newzroom Channel 405.